Good afternoon, everybody. This is Lori Thompson from NATO. Welcome to today's webinar on procurement standards under OMB Super Circular. I'm hoping that Christine Frost from Northern Border Regional Commission will connect in a few minutes. We're having a little technical difficulty with that, but if she does, she'll certainly join in with a few words. But in the meantime, I just want to welcome everybody and thank you all for taking the time again today to participate in the webinar. It's the second in the series of two that our speaker is doing for us today. They are part of the LDD capacity building workshop, which Northern Border Regional Commission conducted in mid-July in Stowe, Vermont. Our speaker, Bob Lloyd, couldn't join us in Stowe, so we thought the next best thing would be to do some webinars. So having said that, I still don't see Christine on. I will go ahead and introduce Bob and let him run with it. So I think a lot of you probably already know Bob. He's been around these circles for quite some time. He is speaking at various NATO conferences and has done webinars for us for probably the past 10 years or more. He's a respected authority on policies and practices affecting the award, administration, and oversight of federal grants. He's been doing this for 40 years. He's been working in the federal arena. He started his practice as a consultant in 1982. Prior to that, he was executive director of the Grants Management Advisory Service. He's been a consultant, trainer, and advisor to award and audit units in 16 federal agencies, and he's also worked with recipient and sub-recipient organizations throughout the U.S. and abroad. Before I turn the controls over to Bob, I just wanted to note that you can ask questions by typing them into the right-hand side of your computer screen, and we'll get to those probably at the end of the webinar. And we are recording the webinar, and everybody who registered and attended today's webinar will get a copy for future reference, and we'll also send it to those who were at the workshop who could not join us today for the webinar. So having said that, unless Christine has joined us and wants to say a few words, I'm going to turn it over to Bob.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Laurie, and it's good to be back with you for our deep dive into how to buy goods and services using federal grant funds. We carved this particular session out of the general overview that we presented last week on OMB's so-called Super Circular, and in part because if you look at a grant budget on what I'm sure many of our participants are familiar with, the standard form 424A budget form, you see that with the exception of personnel and fringe benefits, every other line item in a grant budget is something you have to engage in procurement on. And so knowing how to do it based on the rules is a critical skill. This is also a topic that has been arguably one of those that has caused the most angst since OMB revised its grant management policies at the end of 2014 and consolidated a variety of OMB circulars affecting different kinds of performers into a comprehensive whole. That heartburn that occurred on procurement was primarily experienced by colleges and universities and nonprofit organizations, but nonetheless, it was something that has had a direct impact on what you now have to deal with. And given the roles that most of you, the participants, have in providing technical assistance to Northern Border Regional Commission recipients, this is a topic that you need to understand. Now, the presentation I'm going to give is very thorough, but I'm not going to hit every slide with the same level of emphasis because some of the policies that are here, quite frankly, assume that everybody is down the street from the Office of Management and Budget in Washington, D.C., and that the kind of marketplace that exists there is something that exists throughout the country, and that's certainly not the case. I did have an opportunity this past week to look at NBRC's website and see some of the listed projects that have recently been funded, and that's given me what I hope is a good window into the kinds of things that you're going to be dealing with in the months ahead. Perhaps the thing I also helped ground myself in is after last week's webinar, I spent a little time watching TV, and I saw a couple of episodes of Northwood's Law, but even more importantly, I got to watch all 4 games in a Boston Red Sox sweep of the New York Yankees. And so you will figure from that what my affiliation really is. Anyway, let's turn to slide number 2 in the deck and talk a little bit about what we're dealing with in terms of policy. The excerpts from 2 CFR 200, 317 to 326, those are called the procurement standards. The feds have told you in about 6 pages of federal regulation what it takes them 6 books of federal rules to tell themselves. Those books are contained in what's known as the Federal Acquisition Regulation. Now, there's also an appendix to 2 CFR 200, which contains the standard clauses that you're required to put into a contract when you buy goods or services with a federal grant. So suffice it to say that what we're talking about in terms of policy are some skeletal features on which organizations that receive the awards have to hang some of their own policies. It's a combination, if you will, of what the feds expect. In other words, a standard that they expect everybody to be able to meet, whereas they recognize that there's a lot of diversity out there and lots of organizations will exceed the federal standards. But what they're concerned about is that everybody reach the federal standards. Now, the influences that occurred on these policies came out of previous OMB circulars related to administration. OMB Circular A102, Section 36, was what applied to state, local, and tribal governments. A110, Sections 40 to 48, applied to nonprofit organizations, colleges and universities, and hospitals. So it's not like OMB started from a standing stop. They borrowed some of the language from each of those places. But suffice it to say that they borrowed more heavily from A102, the governmental policies, than they did from A110, the non-governmental policies. And whoever wrote this for OMB, I think thinks that the Federal Acquisition Regulation, even though it doesn't apply, is the greatest thing since sliced bread. So let's keep that in mind as we go forward here. We're not talking about the rules that the federal government would use to purchase. We're talking about the rules that they impose on recipients to engage in that. Now, we move over to slide number 3, and the first part of the reg deals with policies affecting states. There's broad reliance in this rule on something called the Model Procurement Code for state and local governments. Back in the 1970s, the American Bar Association developed this document, and not surprisingly, many state legislators bought into it and enacted legislation in the states that mirrored what that model code said. So the fact that the government simply says to states, you can rely on state law and procedure when you do the purchasing. Now, OMB does not assume that state governments tell everybody who's part of the state, that is, local governments, school districts, nonprofit organizations, that they don't tell them how to purchase. So the assumption is sections 318 to 326 tell other non-state grantees how to handle the purchasing function. Now, when this particular policy was promulgated and issued, effective December 26, 2014, as I mentioned a moment ago, a lot of organizations, particularly in the non-governmental sector, had significant reservations about it. And they're very vocal, particularly the colleges and universities. So they went to OMB and negotiated something I never have seen in all my time in this field. OMB granted a grace period for implementation of the procurement requirements. Initially, they did it for 1 year, then they extended it to 2 years, and finally they extended it for 3 years. Well, those 3 years are up, and so organizations that get federal grants are expected to implement the procurement requirements. I suspect that some of the grantees of the NBRC are organizations that didn't have to deal with this in the past because they might not have been funded with federal funds. But now that they are going to be going forward with a federal grant in hand, these policies have to be followed. Now, one of the things we need to also explore here, and this is something I brought up in the initial program a week ago, but it's absolutely critical, is an understanding of the nature of a contract under a grant. Under 2 CFR 200-330, grant recipients who enter into so-called lower tier relationships are supposed to determine whether the relationship that they are entering into constitutes that of a sub-recipient or a contractor. Now, I recognize, and I think OMB recognized, that a lot of people are very careless about their use of terminology when they're talking about other relationships under a federal grant. So the term contract under a grant is absolutely critical here. Now, if you turn over to slide number 4, there's a chart which we used in the previous session, but I want to emphasize what we're dealing with right now by using the chart. At the top of it, you see the federal government, and that would be, in our case, the Northern Border Regional Commission. When they make a grant to somebody, whether it's a governmental unit or a nonprofit organization, that organization is referred to as a grantee or recipient. But it may also, because of its role, be considered something called a pass-through entity. Now, as you can see from the chart, below the grantee recipient box, there are 2 splits. One is to a sub-recipient or sub-grantee, where the federal funds that are being provided are to help that sub-recipient. It's an assistance relationship. Benefit is flowing downhill. On the other hand, on the right-hand side of that chart, when the recipient is entering into a contract under a grant, they are buying something from the contractor. And so the line that connects recipient and contractor relates to the policies we're talking about in this webinar. Now, that same set of concepts might actually arise at an even lower level, where the sub-recipient becomes an organization engaged in lower tier relationships and maybe passing money along to a sub-recipient and maybe buying goods or services under a grant through a procurement contract. So how organizations enter into those contracts under grants is what all this is about. Now, slides 5 and 6 get into some detail about how the instrument selection is supposed to be undertaken. That's a little bit repetitious of what we covered last week, but suffice it to say that the most important part of this has to do with the nature of that relationship. And when we're talking about assistance, then we're dealing with a sub-recipient relationship. The benefit is flowing downhill. We're trying to help the sub-recipient by giving them federal funds to spend. On the other hand, on slide number 6, we focus on characteristics that are indicative of a procurement relationship. Now, if you look up the word procurement in Webster's dictionary, or perhaps even more importantly, Black's Law Dictionary, you'll see that procurement involves bringing a buyer and a seller together. It's a commercial type transaction, okay? And what OMB says is that it can be a commercial type transaction between a recipient and some other party, and it's not necessarily critical who the other party is. It can be a commercial organization, somebody you're buying office supplies from, or construction contractor, or it could be another governmental unit or nonprofit organization. What's important isn't the nature of the parties to the relationship, it's the nature of the deal, and the deal is buyer-seller, okay? Now, moving over to slide number 7, OMB warns in this instrument selection discussion that the pass-through entity needs to use judgment in terms of the type of relationship they're entering into. What's important is the substance of what's going on in the relationship, and not all the characteristics that were listed on the previous slides are necessarily always have to be there. Okay, there's no single silver bullet in any of those listed characteristics that makes it one thing or another. Okay, and as you can see, what's not mentioned anywhere in the rules is the type of pass-through entity, the type of lower tier entity, or the pricing of the agreement. One of the things that OMB did, and I mentioned this in last week's presentation, in the revision to the super circular, is that they encouraged federal agencies and pass-through entities to engage in what are called fixed amount awards, which are essentially grants and sub-grants on a fixed price basis. So you can have a fixed price contract or you can have a fixed price grant, okay? And the rules permit both to happen. Different kinds of things have to be done under those arrangements. But the important thing is the nature of what's going on, and it's buyer-seller. Now, the resulting agreement, there's a contrast between what's supposed to be put into a contract under a grant versus what's supposed to go into a sub-grant. 2 CFR 200, Appendix Roman numeral 2, contains standard clauses that you have to put into a contract under a grant. You either need to, cite them verbatim or cite them by reference, but they need to be there because they are laws and regulations that by their terms apply to that relationship. On the other hand, in 2 CFR 200-331A, OMB lays out the things you're supposed to put into a sub-grant, and they are different. And so, one mistake that I know a lot of organizations may have made in the past is they've mixed all this stuff up together and they've called something a subcontract or a memorandum of understanding or some other, partner agreement is another term that, emerges from that morass, and they send it down to somebody else, and no wonder everybody gets confused. So this is an opportunity with the new rules to sort some of that stuff out. And again, if you don't take anything away from this program, take away the fact that when you help somebody write a contract under a grant, those provisions from 2 CFR 200 Appendix Roman numeral 2 need to be there. Now, slide number 8 captures the topics that the procurement standards address. I'm going to be willing here to criticize OMB in terms of their presentation. They jumped all over the map in terms of the flow of the regulations. For example, the discussion of contract administration, which is one of the last steps in the process, appears long before the discussion of how you select contractors. It's backwards. So what I've tried to do in the presentation is to take a more logical, sequential approach to this. And if I were writing a procurement policy for an organization, and I obviously have had to do that from time to time, these headings on slide number 8 would be the chapter headings or the section headings that I'd be using, because they go in, I think, the order of appropriateness. Now, moving on to slide number 9, let's talk about recipient and sub-recipient responsibility for procurement. First off, I used the term earlier that the federal rules are skeletal. You're going to have to hang some flesh on those by relying on your own organizational procedures. And here's the thing. OMB was recognizing that many of the organizations that were going to be receiving federal grants or already have received them have procurement policies of their own for spending their own source revenue. And so aligning those with the federal standards becomes the challenge that organizations needed to undertake when these new rules came along. Well, OMB makes it clear that there's privity of agreement. That's a legal term that establishes who's a party to the agreement. And the parties to the agreement are the recipient and the contractor, or the sub-recipient and the contractor. The federal government is not a party to the contract. And while there are some opportunities for federal agencies to review procurement procedures and procurement actions, that's not a common practice, and it's obviously in many cases not welcomed by recipients and sub-recipients. Section 203.18K, as in kilo, establishes that the recipient or sub-recipient is the sole authority for dealing with all matters that arise under their procurements. That includes pre-award activities, so irregularities in the solicitation or bid protests by disappointed contractors. It's up to the recipient or sub-recipient to deal with that. Those parties can't go around the recipient or sub-recipient and ask Big Brother at the federal level for some help. Similarly, anything that goes on in post-award is going to be something that is up to the recipient or sub-recipient to deal with. Interpretation of the agreement, for example, claims for payment, things of that nature, so-called post-award disputes. And the point here is that as an organization purchasing with federal funds, the recipient or sub-recipient has significant authority, and to put it another way, they're the customer and they're usually right. Now, Section 203.24 of the reg discusses grantor agency involvement, and it does permit federal agencies to review the procurement procedures of a recipient or sub-recipient, and if those procedures don't meet the federal standards, to require the recipient or sub-recipient to submit procurement documents related to a particular transaction for review. Now, I would argue that a lot of federal agencies don't have the time to get involved in that kind of minutia, but it's possible, particularly if the procurement is a relatively large one. Now, moving over to slide number 10, the feds are very concerned about code of conduct, how the people who are involved in purchasing are going to behave. And this goes all the way up and down the organizational chain of command. So the idea is that the code of conduct is going to apply to the governing body of an organization, to their senior management, their chief executive officer, etc., as well as those folks down in the organizational units who might be engaged in purchasing activity. The federal concerns are conflict of interest related to familial connection, and what it says is that if an individual's immediate family is involved in the purchase, that is as part of the contractor, then that person has to recuse themselves. OMB doesn't define what immediate family is, but they do introduce that term as well as the term their partner. So, there's a little political correctness there, but that shows what the concern is. The financial conflict of interest has to do with any party who's got a financial interest in the contractor has to recuse themselves from the purchase as well. So somebody who owns stock in a company or has an ownership relationship of some sort, that kind of thing has to be dealt with. Now, OMB also introduced the possibility of supplemental federal agency procedures, okay? Section 200-112. NBRC certainly hasn't issued any supplemental procedures. As far as I'm aware, only a couple of federal agencies have. I believe the Department of Labor and the Department of the Environmental Protection Agency have done some things in this arrangement. So these are some of the concerns that they have. The other aspect of conflict or code of conduct has to do with solicitation or acceptance of gratuities. The individuals who are involved in the purchase can neither solicit nor accept anything of value from a contractor or potential contractor. However, OMB turns right around and says that an organization can set limits related to items of nominal value. So a purchasing procedure that says something like, don't accept anything worth more than $10 from a contractor. That way, if you get a coffee cup or a pen, you're not compromising the purchasing procedure. But, you know, Red Sox tickets, Patriots tickets, other things of that nature probably go across the line. Now, let me mention something here that's also, there's a real concern about the potential for conflict of interest as it relates to kickbacks. In fact, one of the provisions of the contract language that's in Appendix 2 says that you're subject to something called the Copeland Anti-Kickback Act. And the Anti-Kickback Act has to do with arrangements whereby either an employee is forced to kick back money for the right to participate in.
No, because I haven't done the dial-in code. Like, see, I'm if you look here, I haven't done it.
Christine, we can hear you.
Oh, really?
So an employee can't be forced to kick back, but another aspect of that has to do with whether a contractor has to kick back to the federal government or to a grantee in order to receive a contract involved. So these are some concerns that also exist around the code of conduct. Be very careful in drafting procurement procedures or ramping them up based on the new rules to capture these elements. Also, even though it doesn't specifically say so, having disciplinary procedures for violations of the code of conduct are seen to be critical internal controls. So it does not do much good to have all these rules if they are never enforced. Now, a lot of excitement has revolved around the acceptable methods of purchasing. And the next several slides address the various opportunities that exist in this area. Okay? The first is what's known as a micro purchase. And when the rules were first established, micro purchases were purchases of less than $3,000. In 2015, OMB raised that threshold to $3,500. But something has happened as a result of all the angst in the university community that has addressed this as well. In statutes that passed at the end of the Obama administration, in fact, Barack Obama signed the legislation in January of 2017, and in legislation that President Trump signed in January of 2018, the micro purchase threshold for the federal government went up to $10,000, and it was intended to be applied to grantees as well. Now, you see a citation there on slide 11 to OMB Memorandum 18-18, which was issued about 6 weeks ago. What it did was it told federal agencies that they had the authority to instruct grantees that purchases of less than $10,000 could be subject to the micro purchase threshold. The actual regulations have not been reissued to reflect that, but that memorandum provided the authority to do so. So that's something of importance that's a relatively recent development. Now, under the micro purchase arrangement, there's no need to solicit competition. You can buy essentially off the shelf. However, there is an exception related to the Davis-Bacon Act. The Davis-Bacon Act is a Depression-era statute, and some of you have probably dealt with it in the past, which allows the federal government to set wage rates for federal and federally assisted construction. The Davis-Bacon Act regulations define a construction project as something costing over $2,000. Now, there's been legislative fight after legislative fight about raising that threshold, but it's never happened. And so it's a number that means that if you're, fixing the bathroom, you're probably subject to Davis-Bacon. And so that exception needs to be included. It doesn't require you to go in and conduct competition, but it does require you to pay Davis-Bacon wages. And those are wages set by the Employment Standards Administration of the U.S. Department of Labor. Now, another purchasing method that's probably something you'll confront is the small purchase threshold. Now, here's where both the executive branch of the federal government and the legislative branch were out to lunch, because they established that the small purchase threshold could be used for purchases that did not exceed the small purchase threshold, $150,000. That was what was initially done. Now, I don't know any grantee, including the state of California, and the state of Florida, and the state of Texas, and the state of New York, that treats a small purchase as $150,000. Okay? So the likelihood is that the recipient's own small purchase threshold in their policies already is what's going to govern. Okay? But what this procedure says is that you go out into the marketplace and you solicit quotations from an adequate number of sources. Now, there's an urban legend out there that you've got to get 3 bids. I challenge you to find anything in the rules that says that. Adequate number of sources is a determination made by the recipient. A lot of organizations adopt 3 as their policy because they assume that if they get 3 offers, those parties are unlikely to be colluding in the marketplace, getting together at the Holiday Inn and deciding who gets the bid. And I know that wouldn't go on much in the northern tier here, but down in New Jersey, it goes on quite a bit. The other thing to keep in mind is that OMB and Congress, with congressional help, raised the simplified acquisition threshold to $250,000 in that legislation. So I have a feeling that there'll be some organizations who aren't similarly delimited and who will decide that they're going to, add to their simplified acquisition threshold or small purchase procedure. But, bottom line for you folks is that something that's realistic within the context of the grantee organization is a much more likely type of arrangement. Now, moving over to slide number 12, let's talk about competitive sealed bids. And if you're engaged in construction or facility renovation, this is a section you've got to pay attention to. It requires formal advertising, and the expectation is it will result in a firm fixed price contract, either on a lump sum or unit cost basis. There are a number of conditions required for its use, and the citation that I provided to you there, 320C1, goes into those in some detail. The principal ones have to do with the idea that there are competitors out in the marketplace who are going to be interested and willing to offer on this arrangement, that there's competition in the marketplace. And there's also an assumption that this methodology involves the ability on the part of the recipient to be specific about what is desired, to write, in the case of equipment, specifications that identify the salient features, or in the case of construction, to identify what needs to be built or renovated. In other words, facility plans. So this lends itself to that type of arrangement. The federal government thinks this is the best way to do construction contracting. Now, over on slide 13, we have another methodology, so-called competitive negotiation. And probably a lot of you have referred to this as the RFP process, where you're going out into the marketplace and issuing a request for proposals, but it's not something that you can be as specific about as you would in a competitive sealed bid environment. Now, once again, there are certain conditions that are expected to be present. First, that competition is out there. It's possible to either do a fixed price or cost type contract, but the request for proposals must be publicized, and OMB doesn't tell you how to do that. You know, I grew up at a time when solicitation for an RFP was done in a newspaper having general circulation throughout the area where the contract was going to be performed. I'm sure you are well aware of how healthy newspapers are these days and how limited their readership is in terms of hard copy. But the idea of using newspapers or other media, constructing bidders lists, in other words, going out into the marketplace and finding out who's out there that does that particular kind of work, the use of your organizational website, those are all possibilities. The bottom line here is you want to cast as wide a net as possible. Now, the solicitation, which is what the RFP is supposed to contain the evaluation criteria that will be used for selecting the successful contractor and the relative importance of each of these. So price is not the only factor that's going to be considered. In many cases, the ability or performance record, things of that nature, may have greater impact. There need to be written procedures established for technical evaluation. How are these evaluation criteria going to be applied and by whom? It's not uncommon, and even with small organizations, it may make sense to have some sort of multi-person panel where several people review the proposals and score them, and those are averaged or somehow established as a median so that any biases are worked out of the system. The idea here is that the award is going to go to the most advantageous offer with price and other identified factors considered. Now, this has to be used for architect and engineering services, and price can't be used as a selection criteria. This is what's known in the vernacular as the Brooks Bill requirement, and it's named after a late congressman from Texas, Jack Brooks, who I'm sure was urged in this direction by the architect and engineering community. Okay? I kind of wish Jack Brooks was still around. I digress here, but he was a bald ex-Marine who smoked cigars in the hearing room when he was the chairman and wasn't at all intimidated by anybody from the executive branch. Anyway, I digress there. Clearly, this is also something that's supposed to be used for the procurement of audit services. The feds have taken a particular interest in how organizations procure their audits when they're required to follow the Single Audit Act. Now, that, as I'm sure some of you are aware, and we alluded to this last week, in order to be subject to the Single Audit Act, an organization has to expend $750,000 in federal awards during their fiscal year. So some of the organizations you're going to be dealing with won't have to do a single audit, but they may have to do some form of competitive negotiation related to their projects. Now, over on slide 14, a couple of other things we need to mention. Non-competitive negotiation, also known as sole source. Now, OMB has tightened up the requirements related to sole source. This was one of the reasons why the universities got so bent out of shape. There are only 4 justifications available for non-competitive negotiation. The good or service is only available for a single source. Well, you got to know an awful lot about the marketplace to know that. Public exigency or emergency leaves you in a situation where you can't go through the procurement process because of the time involved. Now, this is something that comes up, as you can well imagine, in the disaster assistance arena with FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security. But for most grants, this is a tough one to assert as well, because your approved grant budget established what it was you were going to buy. and poor planning isn't an emergency. That's a quote from some federal auditors that I've dealt with. Authorized by the federal awarding agency. Well, it's possible that as part of a grant application, an organization would say to their awarding agency, we want a contract with ABC company, and here's why. And the awarding agency could approve that, thereby opening the door to sole source. It's also something that could come up during performance, although it's less likely to. And finally, and this is probably where the door is cracked open the greatest, where an organization goes out into the marketplace with its solicitation, whether it's an invitation for bids or a request for proposals, and doesn't get any competition or only gets one offer. So the determination of whether competition is inadequate is the recipient or sub-recipient that's doing the buying. Be careful here, because if the organization engages in practices that serve to limit competition, like failing to give sufficient time for response, or writing specifications or statements of work which are unduly restrictive. That's the kind of stuff that OMB has also identified in the rules. It's in section 200.319 as being unacceptable. Now, the acronym you see at the bottom of that section, JOFOC, stands for Justification for Other Than Free and Open Competition. If you're going to sole source, be prepared to prepare one of those. Now, going back to what I said earlier about the micro purchase threshold, because the micro purchase threshold and purchases made below that level are not subject to competition, that's an arrangement where non-competitive negotiation is also possible. You can see the relationship there and why the universities in particular went to the Congress to try to get those thresholds bumped up. Now, the last methodology I need to mention is time and materials contracts, where essentially you're paying the contractor for time spent and materials used. What OMB says about this kind of arrangement is that it's only permitted when no other contract type is suitable, such as a fixed price or cost-based contract of some sort. In a time and materials contract, the ceiling price must be stated, not to exceed X dollars. And the recipient is expected to exercise oversight so that the contractor doesn't essentially string things out so that maximum time and maximum materials are used. Now, slide 15 and 16 get to the issue of acquisition planning. Now, you won't see any of that language specifically in the rules, but many of the provisions, particularly in section 318, address this kind of aspect. Essentially, calling on the recipient to plan when it is that they need to purchase and how to purchase. There's language, for example, that says avoid unnecessary and duplicative purchasing. Your response to that phraseology might be, well, duh. But if you think about it, a lot of organizations might look at their grant budget and say, well, we've got $20,000 in the budget for supplies, and think that's an authorization to spend $20,000 on supplies, rather than buying what they need and saving money in that line item for use someplace else. They also urge organizations to consider alternatives to purchase. Even though the award may have been approved with the idea of purchasing, if an organization can lease it cheaper than purchasing it, or can get third-party in-kind contributions, donations from somebody else, or can use federal excess or surplus property, all of those are ways that saving money within the project is possible. Now, the procurement element of the grant budget, which is what I referred to in my introduction, deals with the line items you see at the bottom of slide 13. Essentially, all of those things involve decisions about purchasing. Okay? Whether or not they fall into each of the methods that I went over remains to be seen. I mean, arguably, if you have to travel associated with a grant and you have to buy an airline ticket, then that transaction is going to be a micro purchase. But the idea as well is that you still shop around and try to get the cheapest fare consistent with the mission that you have to travel to a particular location. So each of these things need to be considered in terms of the use of the purchasing procedures. Slide 16 talks about some other sorts of things. Managing the supply chain. The idea that, the decision about how much to buy at a particular point is something that also leads to some unique kinds of transactions. If an organization bundles together multiple purchases of the same good or service, they might get economies of scale. On the other hand, breaking out those elements would give smaller businesses, minority-owned businesses, and women-owned businesses an opportunity to compete. And so you've got to kind of thread a narrow path in terms of those decisions. Conducting market research, finding out who's out there. Now, many of you are dealing with areas where the sources of supply, whether it's for goods or services, are not as great as they are in major metropolitan areas. And so going out into the marketplace with requests for qualifications is one way to build bidders lists, or to piggyback on other organizations who are also purchasing using grant funds. This is a place where, for example, cooperation with state government might be appropriate, since the states, in most cases, have been in a position to gather information about known service providers or sources of supply. They also encourage cooperative purchasing, either through intergovernmental agreement, which is buying from another government, joint purchasing, which is joining together with other similarly situated organizations in a coalition or consortium, or piggybacking onto other parties' purchasing arrangements. And of course, purchasing off of state contracts is something that goes on in virtually every state in the union. Now, the bottom line with respect to cooperative purchasing, however, is that whoever's expenditures are being made through those transactions needs to make sure that the party soliciting offers fully complies with the requirements of 2 CFR 200, 317 to 326. I've got a situation right now. I'll just give you the background on real quick. It's involved in the state of Texas, where a regional organization has had a joint purchasing arrangement for some years, and the Department of Homeland Security has criticized their methodologies because of assertions that they don't meet all of the requirements. There's a fight going on, as you can well imagine, about whether or not that's the case. But suffice it to say that DHS and their Inspector General has taken a very hard line on that. So be careful in that area. Another term that's been used in these rules is value engineering. And of course, what that means more than anything else is looking at things from a life cycle costing arrangement. The idea that, for example, it may make sense to buy something, but how much it's going to cost to maintain it, to service it, things of that nature, is going to add cost to the arrangement, and it may not be as economical as it appears based upon just the outlay related to the purchase itself. So, I mean, I'm sure many of you have from time to time thought about whether it makes more sense for you to buy a new vehicle or lease one. Well, that's value engineering writ small. Now, over to slide 17, obtaining competition. I said earlier, cast a wide net, because the feds think free and open competition is the best way to accomplish this. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to get a lot of offers, but it sure shows that you made the effort to beat the bushes and get as many as possible. Now, Section 200-321 requires you to solicit small businesses, women-owned businesses, and minority businesses. That means that in the announcements that you make, you encourage them to participate. There's nothing in these rules that creates a set-aside for any of those types of firms, okay? But the idea that your solicitation documents make it clear that you encourage their participation is an appropriate set of steps. OMB says that geographic preference is prohibited. So you can't say to the marketplace, you have to be from the state of New Hampshire or the state of Vermont or the state of Maine or the state of New York. What you can say is you need to be able to perform in these locations. That's not a geographic preference. But the idea that somebody has to be from a particular location, whether it's a state or a local jurisdiction, is simply unacceptable when all the money that's being spent is raised from every place else. Now, I mentioned earlier the impermissible restrictions on competition. I won't go through these line by line, but 200-319A lists 7 of them that you should be familiar with and make sure that what you're doing in obtaining competition doesn't inadvertently restrict it. Slide 18 addresses the issue of developing solicitations. And another area that the feds are concerned about is contractor involvement in the preparation of the solicitation. What it says in the rules is that if those parties are involved, they cannot compete for the contract. And so this can get a little dicey because some of the kinds of things that are being bought with federal grants involve an expertise in the item or service that's being bought. And you need to know enough about it in order to be able to formulate the arrangement properly. This is where I think, instead of trying to rely on contractors, relying on other parties who've engaged in similar purchases is a good practice. And becoming familiar with other organizations who are federal grantees and who are buying the kinds of things that you're buying or that your recipients are buying is the appropriate response. Now, the components of those solicitations arguably have to include the elements that I've identified here. The program description is the fact that you are funded by NBRC and the nature of the activity that you're engaged in. So you're borrowing off of your grant agreement and perhaps your grant application. The procurement method that you're identifying goes back to those methods that I went over earlier. The contract type, we expect to award a fixed price contract. We expect to award a cost type contract that involves a breakdown of the elements that went into the bottom line price. And this is the place where, again, a specific federal prohibition comes into play. You cannot enter into a cost plus percentage of cost or cost plus percentage of construction cost contract. The reason you can't do that is because of federal statute. The feds themselves can't do it either. So this simply carries forward to the grantee community. Now, something that will be of great interest to your potential contractors is contract financing. Another word for that is payment. How payment will occur, and establishing benchmarks for how the contractor will stay financed is critical. One of the ways that you can spec out small businesses, minority businesses, and women-owned businesses is by having draconian kinds of contract financing, where the organization that you contracted with has to front-end all the expenses and then await payment at the end of the project or program. That's simply not something that a lot of organizations can sustain. I've got something going on right now. I own a house that we lease, and we just had a tenant move out, and we needed to do some renovations and upgrading. And one of the things we're doing is having the outside of the house painted. Well, we contracted with the painter, and the first thing he said is, I need 50% to start. And I stroked a check, and I hope he comes back. So, contract financing is something that does carry some risk, but it also deals with the fact that if you're, dealing with small business contractors, strong construction contractors and the like, they're going to need to be kept alive during the process of the award. With respect to invitations for bids and requests for proposals, slide number 19, here's some of the terminology that comes into play here. In invitations for bids, you're dealing with specifications, and if you are identifying a brand name or equal, you must identify the salient features of what it is you're buying. Now, in an invitation for bids, this is where the terminology kicks in that you've probably heard many times. You're going to make an award to the lowest responsible contractor. Responsive, in other words, they're meeting your specifications or your statement of work. Responsible means that they've got a record of performance and integrity that will encourage you to get involved with them. So things like references and compliance with public policy, such as licensure and tax compliance and so on, would be factors that could be introduced there. In terms of requests for proposals, there's a whole bunch of alphabet soup that surrounds this sort of activity. First off is the statement of work, where you're identifying the tasks that the contractor would be expected to undertake and the outcomes, the deliverables that they are expected to produce. Technical proposal instructions have to do with how the contractors who are offering package their offers so that you can compare them one to another. The technical evaluation criteria have to do with how you are going to select the successful contractor. And there's terminology, again, that kind of gets into some of the technical areas. Arithmetic technical evaluation criteria are scoring points, where you're saying you're giving 20 points for this, 30 points for that, and so on. In an adjectival arrangement, you're saying to the potential contractors, this is the most important criterion, this is the next most important, without assigning any specific points to it. Now, one other possibility that might come up, and this again might be present in a construction type contract, is what's known as two-step procurement, where you say to the contractors, identify your technical capabilities to do the work, and you review that arrangement and decide to solicit best and final offers from organizations that have shown by their offer that they can do the work. That's when you bring price into this picture. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's some special rules for audit procurement that at least some of you will probably have to advise others about. That's contained in section 200-509, but it's a really good window into how the federal government views the RFP process. Now, slide number 20 gets to the issue of responsiveness and responsibility. Responsiveness obviously revolves around the timeliness of the offer so that they get their offer in on time. And by the way, your solicitation should establish what the consequences are for late or incomplete offerings. The alignment with your technical proposal instructions relates to correctness. With respect to responsibility, OMB says these are factors that can be taken into account: integrity, past performance, compliance with public policy, and financial and technical resources. These are where you would be asking questions like, Does your organization have any judgments against it, or does it have any pending suits? Provide references related to past performance and identify the time frame in which that past performance took place. Compliance with public policy, I mentioned a moment ago, licensure and tax compliance are indications of that sort of arrangement. And finally, financial and technical resources. What does the contractor have at their disposal to be able to deliver? And what kinds of commitments have they already made to other clients? How you're going to apply the evaluation criteria needs to be established in the solicitation and adhered to during the source evaluation process. And this is the place where vetting of potential contractors needs to occur. The regulations that are cited at the bottom of slide 20 require an organization that's making a purchase to determine whether the potential contractor appears on what's known as the Excluded Parties List System, or EPLS, which is available to you online at sam.gov. SAM stands for System of Award Management. And I'm sure some of you have encountered the need to check that in the past. This is for contracts over $25,000, which you'll find reinforced in the regulation itself. Slide 21 addresses the issue of cost or price analysis. If the offer that you're getting is based upon a bottom line price, then that's what price analysis is. It's comparing comparable offers one to another. On the other hand, if the offer is solicited with a cost breakdown that adds up to the bottom line price, then cost analysis involves looking at each of those elements from the standpoint of allowability, reasonableness, and allocability. Allocability meaning benefit to the project or program. Now, this is required for all procurements above the simplified acquisition threshold. So I don't think a lot of you have got to worry about that in terms of it being a requirement. But sometimes it's a good thing to do from a best practice standpoint, because this may enable you to review offers and see whether the contractors that have offered it have fluffed things up. So therein lies some of the rationale behind doing this in situations in which it's not required. Now, we're getting toward the end of the process of selecting the contractor. One of the concerns the federal government has on slide 22 is what some people call black box purchasing. And what they mean by that is all the offers come into one side of the black box. The successful contractor comes out the other side, and you can't tell what went on in the box. And as you can well imagine, federal auditors in particular are very concerned about that sort of arrangement. So transparency in how you arrived at the decision to select the successful contractor is something you want to be sensitive to. Now, once that decision is made, you need to issue a sound and complete agreement. And those of you who went to college and took Business Law 101 will know that the elements that I've identified there in those bullets are what constitutes a sound and complete agreement. If you need to, inquire of a lawyer in your jurisdiction to help you with those elements, so be it. But the bottom line here is that you've got to have something put in place that's enforceable in the venue in which you're operating. So identifying the jurisdiction in which disputes would be addressed, the obligations of the parties, the rights and remedies if those are not adhered to, severability, establishing that if one part of the contract is determined to be null and void, it doesn't void the whole contract. All of those things need to be present. And the feds don't tell you how to put that together. What they say is, in addition to all that, the required clauses in 2 CFR 200 Appendix 2 need to be added. And you can add those, as I said earlier, by adopting them by reference, or you can adopt them by full text. I don't think it's a bad idea to give a full text so that the contractor is on notice that these are things that apply to them. Slide 23 gets to the issue of contract administration, a formal way of saying getting what you pay for. Section 200.318B has 2 sentences on the subject of contract administration. It's interesting that the federal government itself, when they discuss contract administration in the federal acquisition regulation, they have 132 pages on the subject. So the skeletal nature of what's involved is pretty clear. The objectives of contract administration are that the contractor perform and comply. The question of whether you need access to the contractor's records probably relates to the question of how the contract is formulated. If you've got a cost-type contract where the contractor is billing you for cost, then the ability to go behind the counter and find out what their cost was might be something you want to avail yourself of. In other words, the ability to audit them. You're not required to audit any contractors, but having audit rights would be appropriate. Another thing to keep in mind about contract administration is avoid interfering with the contractor's performance. There's a concept in contracting known as excusable delay. And if you cause excusable delay, you're going to be causing program performance problems of your own. Now, as far as contract administration is concerned, what tools are available? Well, over on slide number 24, I've identified those primarily thinking about them from a common sense standpoint. I mean, when you and I go out and buy things for our home or our family, we engage in contract administration as well. And the idea, for example, in supplies and equipment, that you enforce delivery based upon what was expected, that you conduct inspection to see whether what was delivered was appropriate and works in the manner that it's supposed to. That as a result of that, you establish a formal acceptance, which then allows you to release payment in accordance with the terms and conditions of the contract. Now, the concept of retainage is something that is alive and well in contracting under grants. The idea that you hold back a certain amount of the payment until the satisfaction of all delivery and inspection requirements, and that you enforce warranties if any exist. So, this is something that may arise long after the supplies or equipment was delivered. Well, those same types of things are also relevant over in services and construction. But an additional one at the very top of my list is oversight of the work process. In other words, conducting site visits in the delivery of services or the conduct of construction. No requirement to do that, but certainly a best practice given the nature of the contracting involved. Slide 25 addresses procurement records. And OMB has a weird way of talking about this. They say that you need to have records that establish the history of the procurement. Well, the history of the procurement starts with the decision to buy and goes all the way through final delivery and acceptance. So the transparency that I alluded to earlier, I think, is reinforced by that terminology. These records will include, at a minimum, the rationale for the procurement method you chose, why you chose to establish one of those methods that we went over earlier, the rationale for selection of the contract type. Why did you select a fixed price contract versus a cost type contract? The conduct of source evaluation selection. How did you select the successful contract? and the basis for the contract price. How did you determine that that price was fair and reasonable? Obviously, when comparison is possible, this is a pretty easy thing to do. But when you don't have much competition, or when you're dealing with offers where costs are broken out, it becomes more complex. Essentially, what you want here is an audit trail from the beginning. And one point I would add here is that the independent auditors who are doing single audits are probably not going to be as aggressive on procurement records as a federal auditor would be. After all, those auditors are being selected through the same procurement methods that we're talking about here. Now, paragraph or slide 26 goes into further detail about those special rules for audit procurement. I'm not going to go into those in great detail. Let me just highlight the fourth arrow on the list, because OMB specifically says that when procurement of audit services takes place, all 5 of these criteria must be used. They don't tell you how to score them, but they say all of those matters have to be addressed. Let me wrap up the formal presentation with just a couple of comments about selection of sub-recipients. Slides 27 and 28 address some of the things we went over last week in terms of the relationship between pass-through entities and sub-recipients. Okay? The point I want to make here is that the procurement requirements we've been going over in this presentation do not apply by their terms to the selection of sub-recipients. In fact, the entire super circular is silent about how an organization selects those sub-recipients. But it does say that you need an effective set of internal controls that provides reasonable assurance you're complying with laws, regulations, and terms and conditions of awards. So, modifying the procurement procedures to deal with the possibility of competitive selection of sub-recipients is certainly possible. Arguably, when you select sub-recipients, the need for the funds is a much higher priority than the capability of the organization. Okay, so the feds are encouraging the conduct of risk assessment related to sub-recipients as a way to emphasize some of those abilities. But the bottom line is you usually select sub-recipients based upon the need for the project, the extent of the problem, rather than the ability of the sub-recipient to implement it. That's why there are provisions elsewhere in the super circular for introducing what are known as high-risk conditions, special rules for a sub-recipient that needs the money, has a needy project, but doesn't have all the management acumen necessary to carry it out. On slide 28, I list out the risk assessment factors that OMB says need to be taken into account and the elements that need to be contained in the sub-grant agreement. Again, if you don't take anything else away from today, please take away the fact that when you write a sub-grant, you're going to have a different agreement template than you're going to have when you make a contract under a grant with a contractor. Final couple pieces of advice. Make sure you document the decision related to OMB's granted grace period. If your organization had grants anytime in the last 3 years, then the purchasing procedures need to say that you're taking advantage of that grace period. The grace period is over, so it's time to get with the program on everything we've talked about. Review your policies and procedures for entering into lower tier relationships and realign them if possible or as necessary. The idea here is that OMB has spent a lot of time focusing on sub-recipient relationships and contractor relationships. And the result of that is that any existing agreement templates that are being used need to be held up against the new requirements. You know, you're not going to be making a wholesale change in all those things, but you're certainly going to be tweaking it. Finally, recognize where the vulnerabilities are going to come from. Okay? Federal agencies and pass-through entities have been told to engage in more robust monitoring, and I can't imagine that they won't be looking at how your organization's engaged in purchasing. Under the single audit requirements, OMB's 2018 compliance supplement, which is their audit guide that they publish every year for the use of auditors, has got a significant discussion in Part 3 about how the auditors are to look at the purchasing activities. And, you know, essentially what they've reflected in that audit guide is some of the changes that I've been talking about. And finally, recognize that federal auditors may come visiting depending upon the nature of the activities being carried out. That may not mean that your organization or the organizations you're providing technical assistance to are necessarily going to be reviewed related to the Northern Border Regional Commission funds, but they may be reviewed based upon funds that are coming from other federal agencies. And the problem with that is if they start to see problems with the way procurement's being done, they'll assume that the procurement mistakes that are being made in one grant are probably arising in other ones. So this is a vulnerability that I think is out there as well. I'm not trying to scare everybody to death here, but you know, these are some things that have gotten a lot of attention over the past couple of years. So with that, let me turn it back over to Laurie and Christine, and we'll try to address any questions you already typed in or that you have going forward.
Okay, so Bob, there was one question, and I'll read that to you. Would the hiring of a contractor to do some simple work, such as painting, that was under the micro purchase threshold of $3,500, be exempt from competitive bidding, but still be subject to Davis-Bacon if it's over $2,000?
I believe that's the case. I mean, the definition of a construction project in the Davis-Bacon regulations is very broad, and it's long-standing. Off the top of my head, I don't remember whether painting was in there, but the Davis-Bacon regulations are contained in Title 29 of the Code of Federal Regulations. I'll be glad to follow up with you, Laurie, and get an answer for that one, and you can send it out to the group. But
okay.
You know, again, you know, this $2,000 issue in Davis-Bacon is something that construction unions have fought tooth and nail to hold on to for years. I mean, I can remember back, you know, 25, 30 years ago during the Reagan administration, that administration proposed to repeal the entire Davis-Bacon Act. And as effective as the Reagan administration was in getting legislative traction, they weren't able to do it back then. Maybe things have changed, but it's still out there. So it's a place to be careful.
Okay, if you do find something that you can send to me, I can send it out to the attendees. Another question just came in. How do you determine which to use, RFP or small purchase, when it comes to other consulting services such as web design that would be greater than $10,000?
Well, I still think, I mean, from a best practice standpoint, if you're going to engage a consultant to do, you know, web design or IT support or any of that sort of thing, you still got to, you know, you're the buyer. You still got to be able to tell them what it is you want to do and what will constitute successful delivery. So in a sense, you're developing a skeletal RFP, even though you're not going to the formal advertising kind of thing that the other portion of the regulations anticipates. So I think it's where the practicalities of buying below the micro purchase threshold still have to be definitized.
Okay, I think that was it in terms of questions. Christine, are you on the line?
I am. Thank you so much,
Great.
and thank you, Bob. Thank you, Lori. Sorry, I couldn't. I don't know what was going on at the beginning of this, but I really appreciate all the coordination, and I hope that this has been valuable to people that are listening. This really stemmed, as Lori said before, from the training that we held in Vermont, and hopefully, we can get some feedback from people to find out if these types of things are helpful and if we should continue to do them. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Well, let me mention something in that context as well. One of the things that Laurie offered, and I didn't object last week, was if somebody had questions about what we covered in that session, they could follow up with me later on because my contact information was available. And I will tell you that 2 organizations have taken advantage of that offer, and I don't mean that in a nasty way. They've been in contact on some of the subjects that we covered last week. So I haven't followed up, but if they're listening, I'll be in touch.
Terrific. And just wanted to mention one thing. In addition to sending out the recorded version of today's webinar, I will resend the slides. There were a couple of minor edits that we did right before the webinar, so I'll resend those, and you should use those going forward to refer to. And other than that, I don't have anything else to add other than thanks everybody for participating, and thank you so much, Bob, for being with us this week and last week, and Christine, thank you for your support and pulling this all together.
And thank you, Lori. Appreciate it. Pulling all this together. It's nice. And we'll be in touch with everybody, I'm sure, in the near future.
Okay. And you should get the webinar recorded version probably by Monday at the latest.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.